William Wallace was born April 3, 1817 in Lexington, Virginia. He came to Texas in 1837 to avenge the death of his brother and a cousin who were killed in battles during the Texas fight for independence. Now Wallace down here in Texas got the sobriquet Bigfoot Wallace, and he became a legend in his own time. He was a Texas Ranger, an Indian fighter, and an early pioneer down here in Texas. Now this account occurred in the year 1849. Now Wallace had 4 dogs which he prized very highly. Their names were Rock, Ring, Speck, and Bloss. And Rock was his Indian dog. Now Wallace could always tell by his actions when Indians were around, and if it was night he would take his blanket and gun and dogs and stay in a thicket nearby until morning. The dogs would lie down beside him without making any noise. Now, on one occasion Rock gave the sign of Indians just before daylight, and Wallace took his gun and watched until dawn. Then Wallace hissed the dogs out to see if they could find the trail, and soon he heard them baying loudly. Now coming to the spot, Wallace saw an Indian down below in a gully, and his dogs were all around the Indian. But the Indian was keeping the dogs from taking hold of him by throwing his blanket over their heads. Now Wallace raised his gun to shoot, but seeing the Indian was not armed, he stopped, and he called the dogs off, making signs for the Indian to come out of that gully. Now search revealed no weapon on the Indian but a small knife, and that knife was broken. The Indian now told Wallace in Spanish that he had been a captive among the Comanches, and he had made his escape. He must apparently been a Lipan Apache. Having no arms to kill game, he was nearly starved. He had broken his knife trying to open a terrapin. Now Wallace took him to his cabin, gave him all he could eat, and then leaving his dogs to watch him, went and got his horse, and he carried the Indian to Castroville. Now Castroville was a very small town about 35 miles west of San Antonio that was established by Henry Castro in 1844, so it was only about 5 years old. And Wallace lived about 10 miles south of Castroville and near La Crosse, Texas, about 4 miles south of La Crosse, Texas. The place by this time was building up fast, that is Castroville, and he had county offices there. Wallace carried his Indian around town for people to look at and would occasionally take a drink of whiskey until he got pretty full. Now a county officer came by and said he would take charge of the Indian. Wallace says, "No, you won't. This is my Indian. I caught him. If you want an Indian, go catch yourself an Indian." A large crowd gathered around Bigfoot and the Indian, and all laughed at the idea of the officer trying to catch the Indian. One of the party present that day who heard Wallace say this was Mr. Chris Bayot of D'Hanis, Texas. Soon after this episode, Wallace carried his Indian to San Antonio, some 35 miles from that place, and turned him over to Major Robert Neighbors, who was at that time Indian agent. So we see this is one of many accounts of Bigfoot Wallace's life here in Texas.